This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 2 of Season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, January 14th, 1911. And I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the About Town section of the newspaper. That part of Westford, bounded by Nabnasset and Brookside roads westerly and the village of West Chelmsford easterly, are keeping social life up to the degree of usefulness by its Owawa Club, which recently had a watch party and dance at Marshall's Hall. That club is spelled O-H-U-A-H-U-A. Gustav Flodden and Frank Mooney were managers. The club has organized for footwork for the year 1911, so it sounds like it must be a dance club. Bicknell brothers have nearly completed their new cottage house on the Carlisle Road, south of Minot's Corner. A new cottage house is also being built in the hemisphere of the famous Makepeace Road, known as such by the famous lawsuit of Westford versus Makepeace, the town being unable to get to Makepeace Road or Man except by courtesy of Tingsboro and Chelmsford roads. It is hoped this new tenant will not get mired in the swamp and thus add fame to name. Makepeace Road runs roughly east and west through the very northeast corner of Westford between the Chelmsford line and the Tingsboro line. It is Westford's name for what is called Dunstable Road in both Chelmsford and in Tingsboro. The name is found as early as 1834 in the Old Town records. The road is probably named for Cambridge merchant and state representative Royal Makepeace, who was born in 1772 and died in 1855, who purchased land in this part of Westford and in nearby Tingsboro in 1807. The lawsuit had something to do with Makepeace suing the town of Westford over the very muddy condition of the road, which was originally built through a swamp, apparently. Reverend L.L. Green of Chelmsford conducted the services at the Unitarian Church last Sunday in exchange with Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey, the pastor of that church. Among those present was Mrs. John William Abbott of Brookline, a lifelong friend of the parish and for many years an active resident of the beautiful hilltop village of Westford. You may recall that John W. Abbott was one of the co-founders of the Abbott Worsted Company. Daniel H. Sheehan has plans in cold storage for setting out 10 acres of peach and 10 acres of Gravenstein apple trees in the early spring. Daniel Sheehan ran the wooden, it was referred to in one article in the Wardsman as the wooden, woolen, cotton, cider, vinegar combination mill on Cider Mill Pond across from the Pelatiah Fletcher House on Lowell Road. John A. Taylor reports 33 below zero in North Dakota, where he was teaching at the university there. The next paragraph is called Entertainment. The Fortnightly Club held one of its do something times last week Friday evening with good, wholesome, intellectual quickening. Arthur F. Blodgett was selected president, William Wyman, vice president, Miss Lillian Wright, secretary, Charles Blodgett, treasurer, after which the following program was unfurled. Reading, Edwin H. Gould. Reading, Mrs. William Wyman. Recitation, Miss Edwin Gould. Dialogue, titled Two Dutiful Daughters, by Mrs. Alma L. Gould and Mrs. Elizabeth Wyman. Reading, Horace Gould. Song, Miss Rachel Wall. Recitation, Edwin Gould, and phonograph. Reading, Mr. Nuthall. The next paragraph is titled Grange. At the meeting of the Middlesex North Pomona Grange held at Lowell last week, Friday, resolutions were unanimously passed after a letter had been read from past state lecturer Charles H. Rice of Leominster in regard to repeal of the law relating to the closed season on wild waterfowl. The resolution passed. Call upon our representatives and senators in Middlesex, North Pomona to oppose the pleasure desires of the sportsmen who are organized to repeal this law. Do let us preserve lovely nature on the wing and in the water, and not let it be torn from us by the cruelties of pleasure. Thoughtless greed has thinned the forest. Let us preserve the air and the wing and fin that do business in the water from pleasurable destruction. This was obviously written by Samuel L. Taylor, who writes the About Town section of the newspaper, and he was an avid conservationist and anti-hunter, I guess you'd say. The next section is entitled Death. The funeral of Mrs. Elizabeth A. Harwood, who died in Worcester January 1st, was held from her residence prior to burial in Fairview Cemetery, Westford, on Thursday afternoon, directly after the arrival of the funeral party on the noon train from Ayer, where she was laid to rest beside her husband and 2 children. The bearers were David L. and John S. Grieg, Francis W. Bannister, and Samuel L. Taylor. The undertaker, David L. Grieg, met the funeral party at Westford Depot and had full charge of all arrangements in town. Mrs. Harwood, although born in Canada, spent her early life among that which is most rugged and picturesque in New Hampshire and Vermont. After her marriage to Ephraim A. Harwood, she resided at Brookside about 20 years until the sale of farm and wheelwright business in 1861 and removed to Worcester, where she has resided for 50 years. She will long be remembered associated with her husband in the active life of the Orthodox Church. That's the Congregational Church in the center, where he was deacon, Sunday school superintendent, and leader of the church of the church choir. Mrs. Harwood lived a few hours in 1911 and was 87 years, 7 months, and 27 days old. Next section is the Westford Center section. Motorman John Sherlock has been detained at home this week with sickness, the result of a serious cold. By motorman, they mean that he drove one of the trolleys that came up to Westford Center. This is the first time in 8 months that either of the men operating our branch line has lost a day from sickness. Arthur Smith, who formerly worked on this line, has been substituting for Mr. Sherlock. Much sympathy is felt for William L. Woods, who lost a valuable horse on Tuesday. Mr. Woods, who was born in Nova Scotia, recently bought the Foss farm, and this horse represented an important part of the equipment. He is an experienced horseman, and after several trials had secured this one, and it had proved just what he wanted. It was young and valuable, strong and intelligent, and its death from colic is a real blow to its owner. Pastmaster Wiley M. Wright and Mrs. Wright went to Groton Grange on Wednesday evening, where Mr. Wright installed their officers for the coming year. It was common practice among the local granges to have an officer from a neighboring grange install your officers. Westford people will be interested in the articles of George Albert Drew on orchard restoration. One is in the Saturday Evening Post of December 24th, and the other in the New England Homestead of January 7th, both copies of which are on the library reading room table. Both are first-page articles, and our townsman is an authority on these subjects. One deals with his work in Connecticut, and one with his work with the Drew Munson Farm in Littleton. And, of course, George Albert Drew was one of the founders, or the founder, of the Drew Farms Orchards out Main Street in Westford. Henry O. Keyes has started work on the old Westford Academy, which he bought and moved to its present site several years ago. That was in 1907. It is to be transformed into a dwelling house for 2 families. He has sold one of the sheds on his land to Alonzo H. Sutherland. You may recall that the original Westford Academy building, which is now the Westford Museum, originally stood on the west side of Boston Road across from the town common. A large granite slab installed in 1942 marks the original location of the building. Reverend David Wallace conducted a prayer service at the Parkerville Schoolhouse on Wednesday evening. He was the pastor of the Congregational Church in the center. The next section is titled Fireman's Dance. The best of weather and traveling for this time of the year, an orchestra that could not be anything but an attraction, and the efficient management of all details made the third annual ball of the Edward M. Abbott Hose Company a great success socially and financially. Brigham's orchestra of 7 pieces furnished the music during the evening, giving a concert program from 8 to 9. At 9 promptly, Chief Engineer Captain Sherman H. Fletcher and his daughter, Miss Julia Fletcher, and Captain J. Herbert Fletcher and Mrs. Fletcher took their places and led the march and circle, followed by a fine order of dances until 1 o'clock. An excellent oyster supper was served at intermission, which proved an attractive feature, the members of the company serving as waiters. The members wore their red shirts, adding a bright note of color to the merry throng. There were many present from the surrounding towns, a particularly good delegation coming from Littleton. The members of the company extend their appreciation to all who helped in any way to make the affair the success it was. The next section is about the Grange. The installation of officers for the year, which is always the routine program for the first meeting of the new year, took place last week, Thursday evening, under most favorable conditions. There were about 100 present. Mrs. Alice B. Colburn, assisted by Mrs. Sadie Colburn, was the installing officer for the evening and carried out the work with pleasing accuracy and dignity. Both these ladies are members of Drake Grange. The reports of the Secretary and Treasurer were given, showing all bills paid and a good sum in the Treasury. William R. Taylor reported for the Executive Committee, and a vote of thanks was given for the best report ever submitted to the Grange from the Executive Committee. At the close of the installation, an oyster supper was served in charge of Alonzo Sutherland, William Taylor, and Cyril Blaney, M.D. The following officers for 1911 were included: Frank C. Wright, Master; Mrs. David Grieg, Overseer; Henry Colburn, Steward; Fred Clement, Assistant Steward; Alonzo Sutherland, Gatekeeper; Mrs. Leonard Wheeler, Chaplain; Mrs. Frank Wright, Secretary; Leonard Wheeler, Treasurer; Miss Addie Day, Series; Mrs. Henry Colburn, Flora; Mrs. Ruth Benoit, Pomona; and Mrs. F.L. Snow, Ladies' Steward. The next section is called Annual Meeting. The annual business meeting with dinner and roll call took place on Monday at the Congregational Church. The fine weather was a help in getting out a good representation of the membership. A dinner at noon was enjoyed by about 50, after which the roll call was made by the clerk. The responses were varied and interesting, quite a few coming from absent members who would have mailed in their roll call responses, and several of these manifested their loyalty with gifts of money. The business meeting was called to order at 2 o'clock with Arthur E. Day as moderator. Reports were given from clerk, deacons, pastor, auditor, treasurer, collector, trustees, superintendent of the youth organization, superintendent of Sunday school, secretary, Ladies Missionary Society, historian, and supply committee. The treasurer's report showed all bills paid and a balance in the treasurer's hands. The church has received during the year the legacy of the late Samuel M. Hutchins, $1,000, and a year's interest at 6%. The members voted to send a vote of thanks to Augustus Bunce, detained at home with ill health, for his efficient service as auditor for many years. A vote of thanks was extended to the treasurer and organist for efficiency of service, and to Mrs. M.J. Wheeler for meeting bills for the new dumbwaiter. It was voted to have treasurer renew any expiring insurance policies under advice and consent of trustees. The following officers for the ensuing year were chosen: Leonard Wheeler, clerk; Miss Lillian Atwood, treasurer; Houghton Osgood, collector; Miss Mary Bunce, auditor; Arthur Day, Leonard Wheeler, Charles Colburn, Houghton Osgood, and Miss Lillian Atwood, trustees. These trustees and Miss Sarah Loker constitute the Supply Committee. Mrs. Leonard W. Wheeler, historian, and Miss Bunce and Miss Atwood, assistant collectors. Next section is on the Tadmont Club, the ladies' club in Westford Center. The regular meeting of the Tadmont Club took place on Tuesday afternoon at Library Hall. Reverend David Wallace was in charge of the afternoon's program and had for his subject, quote, "The Spiritual Message of Robert Browning," end quote. Mr. Wallace showed himself a genuine student of the mastermind of this poet and gave a sympathetic and discriminating interpretation of his spiritful message to the world and portrayed him as the finest type of optimist, using many fine passages to illustrate his essay. The president, Mrs. Loker, also assisted him with readings from the poet. It was an afternoon of enlightening enrichment to the mind of the thoughtful listener, and once again is the membership indebted to one of its honorary members. Reverend Wallace was the honorary member, and he was honorary because it was a women's club, I believe, and they would make men honorary members if they served the club in some way, as he did. The next meeting of the club, January 24th, should prove of much interest. It is children's afternoon and will be in the vestry of the Unitarian Church at 2:30. Mrs. Belle Harrington Hall, reader of Lowell, who has won for herself the approval of this club in the past, will be the entertainer of the afternoon and will have special reference to the children with her program. A club tea will be served, and the afternoon will be in charge of Mrs. Homer Seavey, Miss Eva Fletcher, and Miss Winifred Burnham. The next section is Forge Village. The members of the RTS, that's the Religious Tract Society, the RTS Club, held a concert in their rooms on Saturday evening, which was very much enjoyed by all present. The program was varied, songs and recitations being among the principal numbers. The banjo solos by Harry Brown were well applauded. Workmen are busy cleaning and tearing away brush, also chopping down trees in Cameron Grove to make way for a spacious park to be opened next summer. The park will certainly be very much appreciated by all in the village who have found rest under the shady trees and cool breezes from the pond heretofore. I believe this is a reference to what is now the ball field located just to the left of Cameron School, or Cameron Senior Center now, as you face the building. The Ladies' Sewing Circle held their regular meeting on Wednesday afternoon. These ladies have planned to hold a bean supper on Wednesday evening, January 18th. The supper will be followed by an entertainment under the direction of the Girls Friendly Society and will be well worth patronizing. Mrs. Lester McClenna and her sister, Miss Agnes Charlton of Graniteville, were guests on Wednesday of Mrs. John E. Burnett. Next is the Graniteville section. This month promises to be a very busy one for the social life of our different organizations here. The members of the Men's Club of the Methodist Episcopal Church have already begun rehearsals for some form of entertainment to be given in the near future, while the members of St. Catherine's Temperance Society are now rapidly progressing with their plans for the coming concert and dance to be held here soon. The Ladies' Aid Society of the M.E. Church met with Mrs. Charles G. Sargent on Thursday, January 12th at the usual hour. F. Russell Furbush, the well-known chauffeur, left here last week for Palm Beach, Florida, where he will spend the next 2 months. Mr. Furbish went by the way of boat and was accompanied on part of the trip by Bert Derone, a former resident here who was on his way to Pinehurst, North Carolina, where he will be found at the Carolina Hotel for the next few weeks. Bert Derone was a baseball player and I believe was going to Pinehurst, North Carolina, to play winter baseball. He was also mentioned in the March 19th, 1910 Westford Wardsman issue in the same capacity. Miss Annie Healy will spend the next few weeks in the sunny South, where she has a position in one of the large hotels in Florida. The next section is called Real Live Goat. The Cameron Circle, C of F of A, that's Companions of the Foresters of America, held a very interesting meeting in their rooms last night. 2 candidates were initiated with the assistance of a, quote, real live goat, end quote, which caused great excitement for a few minutes. The officers of the circle were duly and legally installed by their deputy, Miss Rebecca Leduc, assisted by the Grand Outer Guard, Mrs. Julia Wall, who assisted as marshal. That's the news in Westford for the week ending January 14th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford CAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.